coming. Good crowd we got here tonight. So just a little bit of background before I introduce our speaker. I've been a member of the church here since about 2009, and for the last few years we've been doing a land acknowledgement like a lot of churches and other organizations do, but we've been exploring ways to go beyond that a little and do things, whatever would be most helpful to honor and help the people who stewarded this land since time immemorial. And this is part of that effort. So I will just go ahead without further ado. I'll introduce Sam Robinson, elder of the Chinook tribe. Yeah.
Slahayam Kanaway Slatska, ik de Tlush Pusnanicha Nisaika Uksan. So, hello everyone, it's good to see you here today. Nikanim Sam Robinson, my father was Scott Robinson, his mother was Dora Clark, and Dora Clark's mother was Annie Hawks. And Annie Hawks' father was John Hawks, and John Hawks was enrolled over Shoalwater Bay on the north side of the Willapa Bay there. And he was married to Nellie Cecina, and she was a Chehalis woman. And John Hawks' father was Thomas Huxwell. He was a chief. He was the head of the lower Chinook down in that area which today we call Ilwaco or Long Beach. And he signed the 1851 Anson Dart Treaty to cede that land away. And he was married to Chais, my third great grandmother, a high status Willapa woman, and she was lived in the Willapa Bay, in that Bay Center area. And I'll talk a little bit about her as well. And that's how I'm able to be here with you today, because of those people. It's important that we share our lineage because, there's a time in history where the federal government tried to erase that from our memories, and we want to make sure that we know. And in Indian country, we often, our leaders often think about 7 generations down the road. So today, when my granddaughter gets up and talks like I just did and tells the lineage, she's going back 7 generations. So those people that she's talking about, we're thinking about her generation, so I feel pretty strong about that. I'm currently serve as the elected vice chairman of the Chinook Indian Nation. I've been on tribal council since 2001 and continuously served. I just got reelected for my 9th 3-year term, so I guess they want to keep me around for a while. So that's a good thing, but I'll be talking about who they are and so forth. But I really want to get us going with a blessing song. So. Ho 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 hey ho 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 hey ho 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 yo ho hey ho 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 hey ho ho just a little bit about my drum. I always like to tell the story of this drum. It's been kind of my go-to drum for a while. And for many years, we would have our winter gatherings at the Plank House, the Catapodal Plank House over in Ridgefield. And when we did, we invited folks from other tribes in, and we'd rock the house out, singing, dancing, storytelling, lifting up people, for what they've done. All kinds of good things, good work being done in there. And one year, a friend of mine, Tom Spears from the Duwamish tribe, Chief Seattle's people, he was there, and I gifted him a rattle that I made, these Chinook paddle-like rattles, and he was just so happy to get that rattle. And then he was telling me that he never made rattles, but he did drums. And I'd seen some of his drums online, and I said, yeah, you do beautiful work, Tom, and so that, that was kind of the end of that, and the next year he comes back and he's showing me this drum. And he says, what do you think? And I said, it's beautiful. Tell me about it. Tell me, what is this? He says, this is the Duwamish creation story on this drum. I don't repeat it because I don't know it by heart, so I don't want to mess it up, and I don't know what their taboos or protocols are, when you do tell those type of stories. But anyway, so he was telling me about it, and then he goes, here. I go, well, what are you talking about, Tom? He said, I'm in debt to you, and I want to play that rattle. I haven't played it until I settled his debt, and so he gave me this so he could play that rattle. So those old protocols and those old things, continue to go on, and as we learn or do different things, we're trying to carry on a lot of that kind of work. And so that's just a story, and it's been my go-to drum for several years now. So this here is our Chinook flag. Tony Johnson created this flag. He was our cultural chairman, and now today he's our chairman. And we wanted to connect the spirit face, with salmon, because we're all about fish, and salmon's one of them. So it was a beautiful design. During the closing of the Lewis and Clark commemoration, I was flown back to St. Louis so I could carry that flag down through the stairs from the arch down to the closing and so forth. But as we're setting up there, there's all these other tribes from the trail, and they all had their flags too, and most of their flags had, a lot of verbiage on it, telling who they are or where they're from or whatever, and an emblem, and we just identify this way. And so a lot of people were coming up to me and saying, you've got the coolest flag, So I felt pretty good about that, So, but that's how we identify, with the spirit face, and it shows that the some of the Columbia River style. So like these lines in the forehead. In a little bit, shortly, I'll be talking about how our ancestors had flattened heads and how they did that. And I couldn't tell you why, but I know that they had them. So. And the number 5 shows up in a lot in our work and so forth. But we're very fortunate in the fact that our ancestors left us the stories and the artwork in stone, petroglyphs all the way from up in the gorge all the way down the mouth of Columbia River. So well preserved, and often people will ask us, they'll say, well, where's your totem poles? And said, well, Salish people do totem poles, Chinook people didn't. We put all of our artwork on the things that we used, whether it be woven into a basket or carved onto a canoe or into a ladle that you use for soup, or in wooden bowls or whatever it is. It was all put into things you use from day to day. So you had these spirits with you all the time. So, whoops. I gotta figure out, I gotta point that way, I think. There we go. So the Chinook Indian, we're a nation of 5 tribes, the Chinook Indian nation. We used to call ourselves just the Chinook tribe, but then it kind of confused people when we tell them we were 5 tribes, And so on the Washington side, we got the Wakaikam. We start about a little bit by Oak Point, a little bit downriver from Longview. So we have the Wakaikam over here, Calf Lamet down in that area. Lower Chinook in this area, and then the Willapa, over here. My third great grandmother lived up in an area right there, and my wife and I, it's a little community called Bay Center, and my wife and I were blessed that we have a little house down there that's only an eighth of a mile from that village where my third great grandmother lived. Had great aunties and uncles around, and other, and second great grandparents, that were there, and so on. So got a lot of roots on that little island, and we feel pretty good about it and feel pretty blessed to be able to be there. And then on the Oregon side, we had the Cathlamet and the Clatsop. And the Clatsop goes all the way down to Tillamook Head. We're on the north side of Tillamook Head. So we cover a pretty vast area. And these areas were identified in a treaty that we signed, and so that's why we can say, hey, this is us, where we at. Now there was other Chinook people that, they went all the way up to the Dalles, but they signed different treaties. For instance, the people in this area would have been the Multnomas, and then a little further down the Clackamas, and then the Cascadia out towards Washougal. And when they signed their treaties, they got marched down to Grand Ronde. In that Willamette Valley Treaty of 1855, it clearly states that the land on the northern shore would be determined at a later date, but like most government promises, if it wasn't in writing, you're not going to get it, and they didn't. So you don't hear much about them over here, but when I'm speaking, I make sure I tell people that they were over here. And Grand Ronde's a reservation of about 30 tribes. Some of them from the plateaus, some of them from California, all over Oregon, so because they were all marched to Grand Ronde. Chinook, we signed treaties, and I'll be talking about. I don't want to jump the gun here, but I'll tell you a little bit about that. Oh, to click it again. Oops. Okay. There we go. Thank you. So this mountain up here, Saddleback Mountain, that's where we came from. That's where the Chinook people came from. And so we have a creation story. I talked about Duwamish having a creation story, but we do too. And creation stories are sacred stories. There's many of them, how different things were created and so forth. And when people were asked me about what kind of religion did Chinook follow, and I would tell them we had a lot of taboos. Things had taboos. Way you had to do things. Particular things. The other thing I tell people is that before we were here, before we came from Saddle Mountain, the animals were here, and they thought that they were people, and so they were kind of making all the rules on what you did about life and death and marriage, and it's every little thing, from drinking that water in the morning, or how you ate or harvested, stuff, and so everything had a taboo, from the time you got up until you went to bed. It could be walking down a path and there's a frog in the middle of the path, so you go to the right of it, or a woman not wearing beads or necklaces of any type because they didn't want to confuse that child and have it wrap that umbilical cord around its neck, or just on and on. And even today, some of the taboos we still follow. For instance, we were on canoe journey one year, and a Canadian tribe was crossing with some youth, this elder with some youth in the canoe, and they flipped the canoe on the way over, and they got the canoe uprighted and everybody back in it, but they couldn't get him back in it, and he said, "Go without me," and he passed. And but we made sure we stayed off the water for 2 days because we knew his spirit was in transition, and we didn't want him reaching out to our youth, pulling them into that, so we just stayed off the water. That's what you do. So there's just different taboos, different tribes, and so forth. But anyway, one of the taboos that we have is these econom stories you can only tell a certain time of the year, and that's from the first frost until the frogs start singing again. And that's when we do our winter gatherings and we tell our stories. And It seems like lately those frogs don't quiet down too much quick. It's like a real short session, you know. So, and unfortunately, we got to get busy and we kind of spread it out. But we ask for forgiveness from our ancestors, and sometimes we move ahead, tell the story, or if we don't think we're going to get the story quite right, we'll ask for forgiveness from the ancestors as well. I guess I'm going to risk it. The taboo is if you tell a story out of season, you might get stung by a bee or bit by a snake. So it's not like anything terrible is going to happen to you, but something could happen to you, you know. And I don't think there's any poisonous snakes around, so I feel pretty good about that. So anyway, now I'll give you kind of a condensed version, but old man Southwind was coming up the coast, and when he got down to the mouth of the Columbia River on that south shore, he was tired and he was hungry, and he saw this giantess, this big woman, and he asked her. He said, "Do you have any food for me? Because I traveled a long ways." And he goes, "No, I don't have any food for you, but I can give you a net, and you can go out and you can catch a fish for you to eat." And so he casts that net out and he pulls in a small whale, and he pulls out a knife. And the giantess told him, he said, "Now when you catch that first fish or that whale, you need to cut it down the back. Don't cut it crosswise, because that's one of those taboos. You got to cut it down the back." And so he ignored what she said, and he started cutting that whale crosswise. And all of a sudden, there was just like this thunderous sound coming out of this whale, you know. And all of a sudden, it became dark because Thunderbird popped out and flew into the sky and flew all the way up onto the top of Saddle Mountain and built a nest up there and laid eggs. And then after she laid the eggs, she took off to go find something to eat. And as she did that, the giantess climbed to the top of the hill and started looking at these eggs and thought they were rotten. She just kept throwing them over the edge of the hill. And as those eggs were being thrown over the hill, Chinook people were popping out of those eggs, you know. And so Thunderbird ended up coming back and seeing what happened, and so the giantess had taken off. So Thunderbird and Southwind took off back down the coast looking for the giantess. So today, when I hear the weather report say that there's going to be a south wind blowing up the coast and thunder and lightning, I know they're still looking for that giantess. But that's our creation story. That's how we got here. So, and all tribes have creation stories. So a very, very sacred place to us. The other thing that's so wonderful about this picture is this canoe here. This canoe is named Itswoot, or Black Bear. My late cousin Ray Gardner, blessed the canoe and gave it its name. It was made by a gentleman named Dick Brummel. He was a Lewis and Clark reenactor, and he had made the canoe a cedar strip canoe. And once Ray blessed it, he ended up paddling it all the way back, and then took it all the way back to St. Louis, and he would race it on the Missouri and the Mississippi River. And he would always win his class, his age class. And I think he was probably about 56 at the time he first built it, but he raced it probably until he was about 70. And then he decided he needed to come back to Chinook country, and he gave it to my late cousin. And then when my cousin passed, he gave it to me, so I'm the keeper of Itswoot. Itswoot's a very fast river canoe. Itswoot holds 12 polars, so you can really get going. And we'll feel pretty good about it. But when I was a kid, we didn't have canoes. So there's a lot of things that we didn't have when I was a kid that have come back. So the generation today, they're witnessing some of that. And I'll talk a little bit about my granddaughter, a proud Choopy, Choopy's grandpa, Chicha's grandmother. Proud Choopy, so you'll see my granddaughter here and there in the picture for sure, as she's growing up, and talk about her as well. So I talked about Chinook people. They had flattened heads. They would put the child in a cradle board with a board on it, and when the skull was soft and just starting to create shape, and it would flatten the heads. So if you were on the Columbia River and you were you had a flattened head. If you're a round head, you didn't come down. You know, so you knew you're Chinook, and you knew you belonged here. You know, and there was a lot of Chinook people. Before the diseases came through, there was a lot of Chinook people. Dr. Ken Ames worked with us on the Cathapodal dig on a village site over by Ridgefield on the refuge. And he was telling me one day that this area right here, you know, like Vancouver, Ridgefield, down through Sophie's Island and into the Portland Basin there, at one time it was the most densely populated area in the North American continent. And it was all Chinook people. So it was even, I mean, when I say more in the North American continent, that was even while the 13 colonies were being settled. There was over 50,000 Chinook people living in this area. And that didn't, you know, and there's people living down the area, in our area, and then up as well. So hugely populated, a lot of villages. I think the biggest house that they saw on the Columbia River was in a village over by the Portland Airport, and that one was 100 feet wide and 300 feet long. Just a mammoth plank house, you know. The Cathapodal village in Ridgefield had 14 houses. 2 of those houses were 50 feet wide and 200 feet long. And when Lewis and Clark stopped at the village on the way back, they said there was about 900 people living in that village. And and they're all, every one of our villages, of course, were just on the rivers because we only traveled by canoe, didn't have any horses or anything. So, you know, the water was our way, you know. So we you know, the canoe I showed you, its route, we actually, we've taken off from Washougal and we've taken off from Ridgefield, and it takes 4 days to get to the mouth of the Columbia River. Now, if we're on canoe journey, we would travel probably a lot further than that, and I'll talk a little bit about canoe journeys, but Coyote, you know, I said those animals were setting down the rules. Well, Coyote said it takes 4 days, so we felt pretty good that he said 4 days. So it gave us the opportunity to stop in different places and actually connect with Chinook people, you know, that lived along the river and hadn't seen a canoe on their beaches in like 100 years. So they were all happy, you know, they clear off their beaches for us and everything, and we'd come in, you know, we're traveling with this canoe and another canoe, and yeah, it was wonderful. It's a wonderful journey. We haven't done it in a little while, but, you know, since COVID, and I think we're about time we need to get back out there and do that journey again. And like I said, it's good. I'll get back to journeys in a bit. But anyway, so yeah, flattened heads, you know. The sad thing about that is that, you know, as our people were dying off from diseases and so forth, and they're getting buried, because a lot of diseases came through the territory. And the first one was about 400 years before the Europeans came in, and that was the Spaniards came through and they brought smallpox, you know. And then later on, as you know, as the Bostons was our word for Europeans, because every person came from Boston. They came around the Horn, they landed over on the islands, and then you would probably get some workers to come off the Polynesian islands, so they were bringing the Hawaiians and so forth into the river, and so we had that connection with them too, you know. One thing that was going on though is that the Bostons would go, for a couple of years, would go up and down the coast, and they would never turn into the Columbia River because they thought that this thing that's 4.5 miles wide can't be a river, it's a bay, you know. And it wasn't until a little bit later that they realized that it was a river, you know. So, and that's when we connected with them. This is a Paul Kane picture, a sketch of people in a plank house. This is a small plank house here. And people hunkered down in there, you know, they had their dogs and all that other good stuff living amongst them. These houses, you know, there's 14 houses, and each house would have a heads person, somebody in charge of the house, and it could be a man or a woman. And so they would be in charge of the house, and the people in the house weren't necessarily related to this person. You know, some of them were, but what these people had in common is that they felt that this person was going to be strong enough and kind enough to make sure everybody was cohesive and everybody did the job that they had to do to make this community of a house good. So they would choose to live in that house. So you could live in any of the 14 houses that were there. You know, they would be drying, you know, up on the racks, and there's a lot of storage under the bunks, you know, for food and so on. Later on, when the fur trade came in, they would store furs underneath there. The Catapodal plank house in Ridgefield, today, the one we made, would have held about 65 people. It was a medium-sized house. And Ken Ames, the archaeologist, he was telling us that Chinook people and one group of people in England were the only people at that time, you know, 2,000 years ago or so, that had subterranean storage in their homes, you know. And he said that a house the size of the one in Ridgefield that we built, you know, the medium-sized house, would have had probably the equivalent of about 60 50-gallon drums of storage. You know, it wouldn't be in drums, but it would be in wooden boxes, baskets, seal bladders for oil, you know, maybe kelp tubes for oil, you know, just, you know, all that kind of stuff. It'd be everything's put away. You go out and you do all this gathering and hunting and all the stuff you needed to do, you know, getting roots and all the other stuff, you know, and you put it all away for the winter. Then you you take those canoes and put rocks in them and sink them, because you're not going to be going anywhere, and just lived inside those houses, you know. And so when I talk to people, I talk to kids, you know, I say, these were the first universities, these are the first colleges in the Northwest, because you'd be sitting around these fire pits and you'd be listening to your grandparents, your great aunties and uncles, your parents, and they'd be telling you what it meant to be Chinook, and what you needed to be Chinook, and the histories. And they'd be telling you stories, because it's wintertime. They could tell you those stories. And some of those stories were pretty spooky, you know, but I think it was kind of, you know, scaring those kids a little bit straight, you know, to keep them on the right path. You know, if you do this, you know, oh, that might happen to you, or this might happen to you, you know. And so, yeah, it's really important that they know that. The first ship that did come in, our first contact was with Captain Gray on the Columbia Rediva. And so this is the Lady Washington, and we do trade reenactments. I don't know if you can see us, but there's two canoes right here next to the ship we pulled up alongside, and we're going to trade with them. Now, Chinook people were well-seasoned traders even when Captain Gray came in, you know, and I remember, you know, hearing stories of down towards, it'd be down towards Cathlamet, you know, people seeing that first ship come into the Columbia River, and they just thought there was a giant canoe with trees growing out of it, because they'd never seen masts. And there was like bear-like people on side there, because there's all these bearded people, you know, on there, you know. And so they made that connection with Captain Gray, and of course Captain Gray started trading. And you know, and when they were, you know, trading for food or whatever it may have been in that first contact. And so it was well written from him and others along the way, is that when you offer Chinook one thing for one thing that they had, they wanted three. Now, three's being lucky in Chinook, you know, and that was just the way it had to be, you know. So they were flashing copper. You know, copper was a sign of wealth. There was Indian copper in the area, and copper was like gold, you know, so people of high status would be wearing that copper. So when they started flipping the copper out there, and they had a lot of copper because they used to line the bottoms of the ships on the outside to keep the barnacles off, but they'd have this copper, they shine it up, and they'd be trading it. So Chinook people would be getting that. So today when we do trade reenactments, I make sure I get my three of whatever they're offering, you know. You know, and offering, you know, the people that do it today, you know, they're happy to get like oysters and clams and fish and stuff like that. So we're happy to give that to them, you know. And I've made some really good trades over the time, you know, and it feels pretty good. We haven't done that in a little while either, but we'll have to get on that. The other thing I like about this picture is you know, you got the original, I call them the original port directors, the Chinook people, because it was our villages were the ports. And then you had, you know, the next generation coming in, and then you had this today's in the background. And I could tell you, we probably didn't even really pay any attention to that ship going by because we were busy doing our trade, and it didn't really bother us much, you know. So I can't say that it doesn't always not bother us much, because one time we were doing that journey down the river, and when you get into Longview, it's really, really tricky down there, because the wind will, you'll go a little bit and the wind will be blowing this way, and then you go a little bit further and the wind will be blowing that way. So you got to kind of watch for flags or whatever you can see on either side. And one year we were going down, we had 3 canoes, and 2 of the canoes were full of people. My canoe only had 6 or 7 people in it, so it was we were traveling a little light, and it was windy, and we're going along. All of a sudden, we're starting to get kicked over towards the rocks on the Oregon side, and so, and that's because I had people towards the middle and back for horsepower, you know, but it didn't do us any good when it came time to steer. So we barely made it around the rocks between a fishing boat, and then I said, okay, we're going to head back to Washington. You guys are all going to get in the front of the canoe so I can control it better. And so they got in the front. And we looked up the river, and you can see about 2 miles upriver. And the guy that was pushing us off in the front, he's constantly looking upriver. He's pushing us off. We just got out there shortly, and we were digging hard and moving good. And all of a sudden, I hear this. Look behind me. I just see this rusty red gray look. I'm like, whoa! I go dig deep, hard right, get out of his way. We get down to Rainier, and the other canoes were already down there, and one of the guys in there was a former Coast Guard person, and he said, well, when you get 3 blasts from the pilot house, that means the pilot house has lost sight of you, and they want somebody to go up front to see if you're still there. Yeah, that's how close they were, but we were fast. But it's amazing how fast he was coming down that river, because we could, like I said, we could see 2 miles, and we weren't in, you know, out there that long, maybe 2 minutes, you know, before he come barreling down on us. Other than that, ships don't bother us. Usually what we do is, as the ship's going by, we'll go out, and then we'll just make a hard left or hard right, depending on which side we're on of it. And I've had that 31-foot canoe that you saw in that one picture in the air, because we go over the wake and just whoop, you know, yeah. So all's good. They're just lucky we didn't trade with them. So. But yeah, oh, and then a couple others, you know, we made a lot of good relationships. My late cousin Ray Gardner, he was really good friends with the people from the Lady, and knew the skipper well and everything. And he was always, you know, the Lady Washington, from the time it first started coming in, it started flying our Chinook flag, because when it would go to other ports, because it was traveling to Hawaii. One day I saw it down in Monterey when I was down there, and so it goes to different ports, and it wants to tell the Chinook story, you know, how we battle for federal status. So that's why they fly the Chinook flag, to bring that conversation up, you know, so that was good. The other thing it does when it comes into our territory to show it comes in peace, it lashes its cannons into the middle of the ship. And but my cousin Ray, he was always joking with the skipper of the Lady, saying, you know, one of these days, I'm going to take the Lady, you know, in Chinook territory. And so one year, the Lady and the Hawaiian Chieftain, another tall ship, were in. And we had 4 canoes out there. We had Suquamish, and we had Clothmine, our big canoe, our ocean-going canoe. And then I had Itzwoot, and then Grand Ron came with Skonkia, which means coyote. So Skonkia, and so we went over to the Lady, and Ray went over. We went over to the Chieftain, and Ray went over to the Lady, you know, to do our trades. And we're probably, I don't know, a quarter mile apart. And the first mate on the Chieftain answers his cell phone, not to period, right? You know, answers his cell phone. He tells the skipper of the Chieftain. He says, "There's an issue on the Lady." And they go, well, what's that? He says, well, if you look over there right now, the entire crew of the lady is in the Chinook canoes, and the flag is being lowered. So Ray did pull it off. The guy that was skippering it, that was his maiden voyage. Yeah, it's very first voyage. The skipper from the previous skipper was in our canoe. He was paddling with us, so we knew we had it covered, you know. So yeah, so he took it for about an hour and a half, and then he gave it back. But you know, the guy wasn't too pleased, and I think probably because it was his maiden voyage, and I'm sure that probably resonated through tall ship country all the way across, you know. And yeah, so he was probably joked about quite often. So, but Ray was able to, you know, be able to pull that off. Nope, there we go. So during the trade, this gentleman here is Chief Comcomly. He was a Clatsop, Lower Chinook man, and his mother was a high status woman. But she didn't want to deal with the Bostons, so she pushed him out there, and he you know, quickly worked up the ranks to become the high status man trading with the Bostons. So he controlled all the commerce in the area, you know, and he lived in a village, you know where Fort Columbia is, on the Washington side when you cross the bridge, you know, there's a little Catholic church there in Fort Columbia. He lived in a village down below, and so he was able to go out through there and, you know, connect with the tall ships and do the trade. And then throughout time, he, you know, not only did he make connections with these folks, but he was also connected with the Hudson Bay Company when they came in and created Fort George down there where we call Astoria today. He also was connected with the Astors, you know. So a lot of his daughters were married to different people in the Hudson Bay Company, or you know, with the Astors and so forth. And a lot of times that happened because that's how you get resources. You know, for instance, if I was on this side of the river and I was a chief, and you know, this you know, I could marry this girl, this lady on this other side, and then I have all of those resources. You know, so sometimes chiefs would have multiple wives for resources. But Comcomly, you know, the one thing that he did that was pretty good for his business was he told the Bostons not to come up into the middle of the river here because these Chinook people would kill them. And he told these people up here not to deal with the Bostons because they would kill them. So he controlled the commerce back and forth for quite some time. And he became pretty powerful. In fact, they say that when he walked the earth, they'd throw furs down so he wouldn't have to touch the dirt, you know. But he was a real high status man. You know, his daughters were real high status people. And he did that for a while. Well, then eventually, you know, Broughton came in to the Columbia River, and he was ready to come up here and go to war, you know, to find out what was going on. So he landed in a place called Warrior Rock, which is not too far from the opening of Lake River, but it's on the other side, to come and see what's going on up here. And when he got up here, he found out these Chinook people were friendly. They weren't warring people anyway. So yeah, so they ended up talking, you know, Hudson Bay to move up here, and that was the end of Comcomly's reign, you know, with them. You know, the Astors are still hanging around, you know, but yeah. So then a chief Casino, or Casino, ironic, you know, Casino, he became the head tradesman in the area. So so we had a lot of roots with those folks up and down the river. I talk a little bit about the Kathapodal village, you know, and you know, Quathaput is, you know, how we were pronouncing it. Kathapodal was how they wrote it down, you know. And that a lot of that happens, you know, as you read journals and stuff like that. They're how'd they say that? You know, so they'd write it down how they thought they heard it. But Quathaput meant it was a place where people were doing. Quatha means make, and put means they were making some things there. And one of the main things that they were making down there is that they were taking elk hides, and they had big elk down there. And the archaeologists, you know, that did the work on Kathapodal or Quathaput, they said, yeah, there's two questions we have for you guys. One, all the acorns that we found were like huge. How'd that happen? And we said, well, when you scorch the feet of the oak trees, by burning, it makes bigger acorns. And then they were saying, well, all the elk were like trophy-sized elk, the bones that we find. And said, well, we have bigger acorns, you have bigger elk, And so they learned that from us. But one of the things they were doing down there, and one of the reasons we're able to tell how far our trade routes are, they were making what they called clemens. And it was a long robe, and it was 2 layers of elk hide. And they would take those and they make them, and they trade them all the way up to Ketchikan, Alaska, and all the way down towards northern to California. And that's go out of the mouth of Columbia River and go one way or the other. And so they found those there, and those clemens were said to be able to stop a musket ball. And because the Bostons were really skirmishing with those coastal tribes before they turned into our area, we were getting those out to those folks so that they, could be protected. So, but anyway, yeah, Comley, yeah, he was quite the man. And this is his daughter, Ilchi. And Ilchi was married to a Hudson Bay guy that was at Fort Vancouver. And there's a big bust of her down on the walkway not too far from McMinimum's. You go down and hook a right on the walkway, and this is down there. And she's sporting, a nice cedar cape, and of course she has her flattened head and so on, But she was definitely a high-status woman that lived in this area, And I'm pretty proud of those folks, that set the trail for us. And then Cathapodal, this is a rendition of Cathapodal when Lewis and Clark were on their way back. They didn't stop on the way down. They set up some tents and stuff, and they just complained that the birds kept them awake all night. And then they took off. They never stopped in the village. But on the way back, they did stop, because by the time they got on the way back, they've already had connection with Chinook people, and that's probably why they figured it might be a good idea to stop on the way back. And, Lewis and Clark, they were, when they were stuck on that dismal niche down there and they couldn't get around the corner for days and they were starving, they couldn't make it up the hill and everything. Yeah, they were looking pretty destitute there. And it was a chief of our Cathlamet people that came across in the canoe, standing up in the front of the canoe as it paddled that 4-mile stretch right there by Dismal Niche, and having no problem. And they came up there and they offered them some fish, because they were hungry, but they didn't want our fish. They wanted our dogs. Yeah. So we gave them our dogs, help them survive. And we also helped them get around the corner because they could never get around the corner, Those logs had to be hard to paddle in anyway, But, from the time Captain Gray came in and all the people wrote about it, Lewis and Clark wrote about it, how good our ancestors were with the canoes. They're just like masters of the canoes. And so, that was all good. And we helped them get around the corner. Now, my theory about them not wanting fish is that these guys were eating like pounds of meat every day because they're burning up, they need that protein because they're burning it up, paddling those heavy logs. And they got up to the, about Celilo area in the falls, and they, those people up there, those Chinook people up there were drying fish. And you could take a big fish like this and you could dry it into a piece of powder about like that, and so it's a lot of protein. So if they're eating this protein, whether it be dried fish or all the way down to a powder, if they're eating this protein and they're drinking their ale or whatever, well, the next morning they got sick, deadly sick. Their stomachs were like, oh, and they just thought it was because they looked down in the water and they see these fish, tulies, they're starting to turn, hooked noses and stuff. That fish was no good. It made them sick. It wasn't the fact that they ate too much of it, but it made them sick, so they swore off fish. They would eat, venison and whatever else. So I believe that's why they didn't take our fish. They just thought, no, we're not going to get sick again. No. So during the Lewis and Clark commemoration, when we were cooking fish, staking out fish and cooking it for everybody, and we always made sure we had Lewis and Clark dogs, hot dogs, we wrapped in fry bread to give those people that didn't like fish, Yeah. But we did get them around the corner, and they weren't, they were running a little bit late. Oh, excuse me, they weren't running late. They got to the place they called Station Camp, which was really our village, middle village. And they spent 3 days there, and then they made the decision on how they were going to winter. They knew that up in Washougal there was a lot of deer. They were thinking about Washougal would be an opportunity to go to and winter there. But the Clatsop Chinook came across the river and told them, hey, we got a lot of elk out here in Clatsop Prairie. And there still is a lot of elk out there, So they didn't tell us on the North Shore, they didn't tell us where they were going. They just went upriver. So we figured, well, they must have went to Washougal, because that's the last we saw of them. Well, they were supposed to catch a ship, not go back on foot, but to catch a ship. And the ship came in about 3 days late because it was skirmishing with some of those tribes up the coast. And when it came in, they asked questions about, these folks. Have you seen these folks? Oh, yeah, we saw them. They were here. Yeah, for sure. Do you know where they went? Said, yeah, they went up the river. And so the ship figured, well, they went up the river, so we're just going to go on our own way, They were only like 6 miles away, They didn't tell Chinook, that the only reason they went upriver is because they couldn't cross the 4.5 miles. So they went upriver where they could cross, and they went down and went into the Clatsop territory to build Fort Clatsop. So, yeah, so they could have caught a ride all along, Yeah, just had to talk to us, And the reason the Bostons and these other people were able to talk to Chinook is because our ancestors for thousands of years were, had those trade routes that I talked about, and everybody, they knew their own languages, but they all knew Chinook, so they were able to communicate by adding a little English and French to the Chinook and create the Chinook jargon to where they could communicate with all tribes. And it was our ancestors who were, shared that language. So, and what's really cool is that when we go out and we paddle to those villages up there, you pick up those Chinook words as they're speaking, embedded in their Salish language. So, but it was a very busy hub. By the time Lewis and Clark got into our area, some of our people were wearing British officers' jackets and bib overalls or top hats, and some of them are traditional. They're wearing almost nothing, if not nothing, Lewis and Clark did complain that when they sat in social circles, that they saw way too much. But this here is the 1851 Anson-Dart Treaty. Anson-Dart was sent out to the West Coast to separate the Bostons from the Indians, mainly in California, Northern California. There was a lot of bloodshed going on down there. So he was down there to get the treaties to get the Indians out of the way. And then he came up into our territory at Tansy Point, which is over by Warrenton. And that's where our treaties were being held. Now, Anson-Dart was the person that came out to get these treaties signed, and he made sure everybody that was Chinook, that was still alive, would be at those treaties to witness the treaties. Now, I say alive because, with malaria and measles and smallpox and all that stuff, Chinook we lost 95% of our ancestors. So by the time the treaties were signed, there was 1,500 people there. We were able to raise enough money to purchase the treaty grounds, and it's very powerful for us because every one of us that are enrolled in Chinook today have multiple ancestors that were there at the treaty signing. My third great grandmother was there witnessing my third great grandfather sign. In fact, I always like to point out this right here is Huxwelt. That was my third great grandfather. That's his ex, there. So they signed that treaty in good faith, but they really worked over Anson-Dart there, because he was going to march us off to Yakima, totally out of the climate that we were used to, no water, no river, couldn't even see the river from Yakima, and the ancestors refused to do that. Said, no, we want to stay with the bones of our ancestors and we want to stay on our lands, And the boss, they've been giving away our land probably for maybe about 10 years prior to that. The Bostons were living amongst the Chinook people. So when Anson Dart was there and trying to get us to move, the Bostons stood up and said, Chinook are good people, they're good neighbors, they're friendly, they should be able to stay. So Anson Dart rewrote the portion of the treaty, said we're going to move, and he said, well, you can stay in the nacelle. Now the nacelle was a place where we would winter. We wouldn't live on the river because it got nasty. We'd go into the nacelle. And so we felt pretty good about that. We signed that treaty in good faith. They were going to give us provisions and so forth. So we didn't go out and do the intense hunting and gathering that we normally do. And they took that treaty off to D.C. And when Anson Dart got there before the Senate, first thing, one senator said that they weren't going to pay Anson Dart because he didn't do the job he was sent to do. The other thing that they said there were so few Chinook that were still alive that by the time the ink dried, we'd all be dead, and they never ratified our treaty. So, yeah. So needless to say, it was a rough winter. We didn't get that food that we needed and so forth. But we survived, and we stayed there. 4 years later, they realized we hadn't perished, and they said, well, we're going to invite them to another treaty. So Senator Stevens, Isaac Stevens, senator of the territory, he invited us up to by Aberdeen, Cosmopolis area up in there to Chehalis River treaties. And he invited us and the Cowlitz and the Chehalis and the Quinaults. This treaty, they wanted to move us up onto a small reservation, create a small reservation called the Quinault Reservation, and they wanted to move the other 3 tribes up there onto that reservation with people who we often bumped heads with, because they like putting warring tribes on the same reservation, hoping that somebody would get taken care of, And we refused. We said, we've got to ratify, we got a treaty. Oh, I got to hustle up, huh? I might go longer. Yeah. Anyway, we refused to do that. We went home. Stevens, he was like, took off his hat on day 1, and he says, see this hat, I'll fill it with gold if you sign this treaty. By day 3, he said, see those 3 ships I came in on? If you don't sign the treaty, I'm going to take you all out and drown you. And we still refused, and he went away. So the next thing was to go to war and haul us off. The Bluecoats were clearly on the peninsula, but the Civil War broke out and they went away. So I felt that the Civil War probably saved us. I think I'm running a little bit behind here. Go ahead, and that's the Chehalis River Treaty there. There was one gentleman there. He was sitting down, and Stevens was pretty mad about him not getting up and shaking his hand. And the guy just refused to get up and shake his hand. And he was a chief from the Shoalwater tribe that was there. And he said, I was born a chief. You had to go to school for several years to become a governor. So he never did shake his hand. So go ahead. And this is Annie Hawks. This is my second great-grandmother. She lived in the village down over the bluff too, and she raised my uncle. And my uncle didn't speak a bit of English until he went to kindergarten. He spoke a Chehalis Chinook dialect that was being spoken in the Willapa Bay. So he remembers living with Chicha. Chicha was a hard worker and a great person. Go ahead. And I just want to show you, this is a picture of my great uncle Clyde. I can remember going to his house and talking with him, when I was a kid. I was able to, he's one of the greats that I knew. I knew a couple great aunties and him. And he had seining rights on the mouth of the Columbia River where they would take the net, stake the net down, take it out by canoe and swirl it around. And by that time they had mules that they could pull them in, because the mules came with the soldiers, and then they would fish that way. Go ahead. And then I have two great aunties in this picture. And this is up at the boarding school up in Tacoma. You know, that when we go for federal recognition, we're always talking about things like we had fishing rights. Our villages, all the kids in our villages were taken to boarding schools. We talk about how eerie it must have been not to have children, you know, in your villages. But we were treated as Indians all along. I mean, you're invited to 2 treaties as Indians, yet you can't say you don't federally recognize us today. What's the issue there? You know, we go to boarding schools. We had fishing rights. We had people signing fish tickets until the 80s as Indians, you know, and they took that away from us as well. This is Kevin Gover back in Washington, D.C. He was the head of, he's a assistant secretary of the BIA, and he was a attorney of Indian law. And when he took over the position, he saw our petition to be recognized by the federal government. Now, we submitted over 8.5 feet of paper to prove we were around, you know. And so Kevin Gover, his staff said, nah, and he said, no, I don't believe that. So he hired some attorneys to help him go through the paper, and he called our counsel back to D.C., says, come on back, I'm going to sign your recognition, don't tell anybody you're coming, because he knew there was some opposition. And went back there and they signed it, you know, and we were feeling pretty good about that, you know. And but we knew that there's a chance it might get appealed, you know, and sure enough, there was a 90-day appeal process, and on the 89th day, the Quinault tribe, that tribe they wanted to put us on the same reservation with, appealed our recognition, and it got it held up to get it into the next administration. And then we were on the docket as a recognized tribe for 18 months. And then the person that took Kevin Gover's job overturned our recognition under the Bush administration. Now, this guy that overturned it, he wasn't an attorney of Indian law. He was an engineer on the East Coast and never visited Chinook country. But he overturned it. So that's where we're at today, you know, dealing with that, you know. But Kevin Gover recognizes for a couple reasons, and one of the main reasons is when he looked at we had lands claims as Indians too. Each one of our tribes had lands claims. We filed a lands claim, and they paid us for our lands. Well, it was a pittance of money, but it was also the exact dollar amount that they said they were going to pay us in our treaties. So he said they administratively acted on our treaties, therefore he was signing our recognition. And But yeah, like I said, that didn't last too long, and we continued. You know, I came on council in 2001. We were a fairly recognized tribe, only to spend the next 25, 26 years battling to get it back. One of the things that we had to prove about 10 years into it is that we in the 20s and 30s, we couldn't prove that we had a government amongst our people. There was no evidence of it. And we said, well, what are you talking about? It was illegal for 3 Indians to stand in the street and talk to each other back then, let alone have illegal meetings. But we were able to go and find those minutes in people's basements, attics, boathouses, wherever. And we submitted, you know, more paperwork to close that gap. Well, when they overturned it, that was found in a desk drawer. They didn't even take that into consideration. So they said we didn't have the continuancy of government of our people. So. But my auntie would tell me, she said the great aunties would get all dolled up, you know, and they'd get their crocheting or the knitting bags together and get ready to head out. And they go, oh, you going over to so-and-so's house to knit or crochet or whatever? And they said, no, we're going to an Indian meeting. They had to make sure they got disguised up so they could go to these meetings and continue the work of our people, you know, and for our people. So I always like that picture there. This gentleman here is Sammy Pickernell. He was a childhood friend of my dad's. He's the person I was named after. Sammy, we took him over to Long Island. We paddled him over there in a canoe, and he was telling us he lived with his chicha. He lived with his grandmother here, and they were the last 2 people to live on Long Island. Now, there was like 11 villages on Long Island over there, And he remembered early in the 60s that his grandmother got the call, or got a letter rather, and said, you got 1 year to move off, we're turning it into a refuge. And so they had to leave, but he told us about as a child, seal hunting and all the things that he would do over there, but a great guy. Oh, there we go. Being treated as Indians one more time is that the government's always trying to figure out a way to make people less Indian, So they said, well, let's give them land. And if we give them land, we'll call them allotments. But if we give them allotments, they'll come and they'll live on those allotments, be able to take care of themselves and become less tribal, less need for the tribe. So what they did is they took all the fish-eating tribes of western Washington, the Ozette, the Queech, the Chinook, well, not the Chinook yet, but the Showwater, the Chehalis, the Quileute, Quinault, Cowlitz, and Hoh, and started giving them allotments. Well, we argued to the fact that we were a fish-eating tribe, and they ignored us. So we sued the U.S., Halbert versus U.S., and we won the right to get allotments as fish-eating tribe in the court, the federal court. And when we applied for those allotments, we ended up with over 53% of the allotments, our people, because there were so many people, we just, all of that applied. And so we were the majority landowner up there, and allotments are your land. Well, the government decided, okay, well, we got these allotments up there, and we really don't want to run them, but they're kind of connected right to the Quinault Indian Reservation, so we'll let the Quinaults run them. Well, yeah, bad news, yeah. A lot of people suffer from that, not getting their allotments logged, or, it's just not good. But anyway, once again, more proof that the federal government was recognizing us, okay? I just did an example of the artwork in our things we use. This is a beaver bowl that was then used for, mashing out acorns and so forth. You'll see a lot of that kind of work being done. Okay? And that's the Cathapodal plank house. That's back when it was brand new. We hand split all those planks. The planks from the front of the house came from a fallen tree at the Rainier National Forest that had been taken down by bugs, ants. And the same thing happened at the Gifford Pinchcock, where another tree had been taken down, and we used them for the side planks. So the rangers had heard of our project, and they wanted to get them to us. So we had these big old trees that were able to split. Yeah, and that's Destiny when she was 3 months old, and the house was brand new. So she's always grown up knowing the house. She loves the house. She's always grown up. Her first canoe that she knew was Skockwall, which means lamprey eel, so she's a friend with that. And our true beliefs is that when you have a house made from a living tree or a canoe from a living tree, and that, you go in, you sing songs, and you bless the house, that it has a soul. And so this is our cousin. We want to make sure we take care of it in the canoes and so forth. And, it really touched my heart is that I go and speak to some school kids in Vancouver, fourth graders, and I teach them a song, and I talk about Chinook, and then I talk about, them being our cousins, and why, and so forth. And then they come out to the plank house, and they're all eager to go in. And we said, oh, no, okay, let's look at the outside. Check these planks out, how thick they are. See, look how big that roof is. And then you let them go in the hole, and they walk in there, and you hear, whoa, And then they sing the song, of course, that I taught them, and we do a blessing song and whatnot. But after we're all done, then they come out, I go outside, and they're outside, and you'll see kids touching the plank house going, thank you, plank house, thank you. So, makes Choopy proud, So anyway, yes, Destiny, she knows it. This is some of our Duwamish friends, and then the Grand Ron friends, dancing, they're getting their culture, they got the cedar capes and so on, and sharing the songs. That's Tom Spears, the gentleman that gave me the drum. I feel pretty strong about that, so we'll go ahead. And the fires are hugely important. Our winter gatherings, we kind of outgrew the house because more and more people are coming. And so we moved it to the coast. The house, I still go in there and do that kind of work, get the fires going, do the songs and stuff. But what I do is I usually go and I'll get some charcoal from the hearth, and I'll take it down to the winter gathering. We'll have it at Clatsop Community College in their gym, and we'll put that coal next to some cedar trees in a pot, so there'd be witness that we're doing this work that we would normally do at the plank house. And then I'll take that charcoal back to the house and burn it so the house knows that we have done that work. And so that's what we were doing there that day. And Destiny, you can see she's growing up in there, So, yeah. And this one I messed up, so yeah. Look like someone's carrying the earth. Doubled up on that picture. What I was trying to do is I was trying to show a picture of Destiny growing up, because she was hanging with Choopy and Chicha all the time and always going around. She knew the songs, she knew a lot of things. So you see this little girl, there amongst all of us guys, and you'll see her rattling and singing the song and doing all kinds of goodies. So she was really good at that. Go ahead. And this is just some of the canoes down in Bay Center. We were crossing over to Showwater on the other side of the bay. We do that because we know it's important to keep our highways open, because we know that the government at times has tried to close those highways. And so we have people from Cowlitz, Grand Ronde, Suquamish, and Chinook down there. And you can see some of it. We got, Skockwall's one of our first canoes, smaller canoe, and then we got this big canoe over here. And I'll talk about that in a second. Okay, go ahead. This is up at Warm Springs. We're at the commemoration of the closing of Celilo Falls. My thought was, as we were going up there, we're trailering it up, and I'm thinking, ooh, windsurfers, and it's going to get ugly up there. But it was like glass, and it was a good day. I had to hook up with our Warm Springs friends and help them, heal. And then Destiny, she was accepting a proclamation for Native American Month from the city of Vancouver. So Choopy's trying to raise her up to be a leader, and I think she'll be ready for that someday. And this is at Canoe Journeys. She's dancing in. This was at Nisqually years ago, and it's going to be at Nisqually this year. Canoe Journeys, usually what happens is one tribal host, and it's been going on for about 30 years, one tribal host, and then everybody arrives there. Some people are coming out of Canada. It might take them 30 days to get to where they need to be. Some people are coming up the coast or wherever. And as we go there, we take off and we'll paddle to the next village. That village could be anywhere between 25 and 42 miles away. We'll be out there 8 to 12 hours a day. And we'll go there. We ask for permission to come ashore, tell them we're tired and hungry, and then they allow us to come ashore. And then, they'll feed us, get us showers. We do a couple songs, maybe some gifting to show our gratitude. And then we pick those folks up in their canoe and we move on, and we just keep doing that. And so everybody's coming from a different direction. And by the time you get into that final destination in today's world, there's about 115 to 120 canoes arriving in these people's front yard. And now the dancing and singing is going to go on for days because everybody gets a chance to take the floor. And so it'll take about 5 or 6 days to get everybody a chance. They start from the furthest away to the nearest, and then you're able to do all that. And then at the end, the host tribe does a big potlatch and they give things away. I've seen full-size canoes given away and totems poles given away, all kinds of goodies, from these tribes. And they're potlatching because the federal government made it illegal to potlatch because they didn't like Indians flaunting their wealth. So once Canoe Journey started, they said, we're potlatching. And they're not going to stop us. So it's good. So this year's Nisqually. I always encourage people to look. I think they're landing around July 31st. And the protocol will go on for 5 days. That's the closest it's going to be to here. And you're more than welcome to go up there and see it, maybe eat some food, and wonderful vendors, and like I said, it'll be going on for a long time. And next year it's a little bit longer drive. Of course, it's going to be a little longer paddle because the tribe that has said they're going to host, you always commit 5 years in advance. We'll be paddling to Ketchikan, Alaska. Our ancestors did it. Okay? And this is just a collage of some other folks, my grandmother, my third great grandmother, my late cousin Ray Gardner, just kind of a collage of other folks in there. So, go ahead to the next one. I was back in Washington, D.C. accepting an award for my work on the Plank House from the Secretary of Interior, and my first time in D.C. But every time I go there, I want to, and then the second time I went back there to lobby. But when I go back there, and I get, like you go to the museum, the Native American Museum or something, if they find out you're there, they want to talk to you. And you've only got like an hour and a half to get in, go in there and look around, so you kind of lose your deal. But on the 13th of May, Maria Cantwell called us back to talk to us, so we'll keep our fingers crossed that she's going to do the right thing. And because she's never invited us back to D.C. So we're feeling good about that, but we're going to spend some time. I'm going to take my wife back there with me, and so is the chairman. He's going to bring his wife and daughter. We're going to spend some time going through those museums, and it'll be good. Of course, I'm sure we'll have other meetings as well, but it'll be good. Hopefully it's not muggy. I heard it was muggy the other day. It was like 90. Yeah, it gets sticky. And that's my third great grandmother, Chais. This is a Curtis photo taken on a little beach down there by our tribal office. For years, we just thought it was a beach that was owned by the state. There was a Chinook village and a burial right down there on the edge of the beach. And one day we saw in the paper that it was up for sale. These guys had inherited it, and it was up for sale. So we offered them like $500 more than they wanted, and now we own that beach. We feel pretty good about that, So, yeah. So, her and Charles Colty are two that lived in the village as well, were the last two people to have flattened heads. And that basket that she has there, Chist is her name in Chinook, and it means that burden basket that she makes. And I have one of those baskets in my house that looks like brand new, I go ahead again. Okay, Chinook, yes, now. Of course, we've got, we're always fighting, for, the status, and this is a way to get a hold of us. But I was looking for a picture of that big canoe. I thought I'd tucked one in there. Can you back up a little bit until you see a canoe here? Well, that canoe I pointed out, the big one on there. The story behind that's a whole nother story. My cousin was asked to be on the board of American Rivers during the Lewis and Clark era. So he worked with this big firm to help cleanse rivers across the United States. And when he got there, he found out this one guy that was a board member, his wife was a fifth-generation descendant of William Clark. So he's always ribbing her about this stolen canoe that they stole on the way back. And so one year he was supposed to go back and help bless a river that they had cleansed. And he couldn't go back because he was having heart surgery, so he sent a Chinook prayer, and they read his prayer. And a gentleman from the Osage tribe, the local tribe there, stood up, and he didn't know anything about the canoe or any of that stuff, But what he did say, he said that a seventh-generation descendant of William Clark would help take care of some of the injustices along the trail. And Lotzi, she started thinking about her grandkids, and she got on the phone the next day, called up Ray, and said the Clark family wants to replace that canoe. We just need to know what kind and how big. So we dickered a little bit with the cultural committee, about what kind of canoe. We knew it would be hard to find out. We want a big canoe, we want an ocean-going canoe, And it's hard to find a log like that would do that. So we decided on another type of canoe. And then we said, okay, now we know what kind of canoe you want. We know who could build it for us. How big? And we said, well, Grand Ron's got a canoe, Skonkia, which means coyote, and Three's lucky in Chinook, so ours has got to be 3 feet longer than Grand Ron's. So we end up with a 36-foot canoe. It's 6 feet wide in the middle. It's got really high sides. It's got a big knifing front end on it, and it'll hold 12 polars and 4 extra polars in the middle and some cargo. And we've gone out of the Willapa Bay and hooked a right, and 4 days later arrive up in Nia Bay with the macaw. We've gone around the Horn down into the Seattle area. We've been into Canada. we've been all the way up to the tip of Blvd on the northeast corner of Vancouver Island, and we're going to Ketchikan, Alaska. You know, so feeling good, feeling good. So anyway, and to go off to the last slide there, I just shared some of our social media. We have a wonderful, wonderful social media. We had a really good committee that put it together. And then when Inutai Foundation philanthropy group hired a top PR firm for us called Rally out of Seattle, they first got to us and said, okay, you know, they're getting ready for a game plan. And said, well, we're going to need to put a social media together, you know, like Facebook and you know, all this stuff. And we said, well, we've already got it, you know, because we had it, you know, so they help us improve on it. But a lot of good stories. And that QR code there, if you can join that, then you'll get letters from us, you know, updated letters on what's going on, when there might be petitions that need to be signed, or call to action for a rally, or whatever, you know. So, and a lot of us, there's some pretty good reading there. You can go to Everyday Chinook, which is a website that Portland State, WSU, Washington Historical, and Chinook worked on. They wanted to write everything there was about Chinook, but they realized they couldn't do that in a lifetime, so they had to narrow it down. But it does have some good history in there. And then chinooknation.org, go to our website, and you can pull down some history and pictures and stuff as well. So a lot to be shared there. So, and tomorrow's Earth Day, and if you go to YouTube, the Guardians of the Waters, if you look Guardians of the Waters on YouTube, it was a film that we made about our work on the Nicanicum watershed, and it had been just at private showings, but now we're putting it out on YouTube. So it's going to premiere tomorrow. So yeah, so I guess we got questions now. I went a little bit over, but I'm always good for questions. Yes. Oh, just a second. You can give you a microphone. Yeah. So, I was in the infantry for a while, so my hearing's. Of course, they're going to take care of that here pretty soon.
With your upcoming meeting with Maria Cantwell, is there anything that we can do in the form of correspondence with her?
I think there's always a need for correspondence to, you know, Maria Cantwell and Patty Murray. On the Oregon, if anybody's from Oregon, on the Oregon side, you know, Bonamici's going to be a key player, I believe.
Mentioning to her, is it basically that we encourage her to recognize the Chinook Nation?
Correct the injustice of the Chinook people not be, yeah, correct that injustice, you know, that
Okay.
Chinook people deserve to be recognized, and, you know, with a long-going history, you know, so. And I didn't say it, but, you know, but we've been here a long time. You know, the archaeologists did some work on, you know, we used to do fire pit cooking, like roots and stuff like that, you know, where you'd put rocks in there and steam stuff. Well, they found one of those pits over there on the, where the G Creek rest stop is on northbound, on that G Creek area. And it was probably supporting the Cathapodal village, but they were cooking some roots there, and they carbon dated that one back. And that pit there is over 10,000 years old. So when I'm at church or whatever, and I start thinking about biblical things, I'm always thinking, what were the Chinook people doing then? You know, and what did they see that made them flatten their heads? You know, I mean, yeah, yeah.
Hi. So you mentioned that when you were growing up that you guys didn't have canoes. I'm wondering when you went later on, more recently, when you started using canoes or building canoes again, were there older people that had that knowledge, or did you go to other groups, other nations to get that knowledge, or how that happened?
I think there was the stories that were told about it. You know, we have one canoe hanging in our tribal office that was about 3 generations back. You know, it was built for this gentleman when he was a kid, and that's about the only canoe we've ever found. You know, but yeah, it would just be word of mouth and stories, you know, talking about it. You know, people that had memories, yeah, that people said, hey, There was a time when there was, hundreds and hundreds of canoes. And it's a real mystery on where all those canoes went. And we know they sunk them when they didn't use them, but we don't find canoes. There was archaeologists that would bring divers in looking for canoes, in that Ridgefield area, because they know they had to be there, because that village was, hugely populated, and so it is kind of a mystery. But yeah, luckily things did get passed orally down, so.
My question was about that. If they put stones in them to sink them, did they ever go back down and take the stones out so they could use them again?
Yeah, they put stones under them to sink them because that way they wouldn't dry out.
And did the stones come out so they could
Yeah,
float
then they
again?
do just dive down there, pull those stones
would-
out,
Okay,
and
all right.
pop back up. Yeah, and maybe when the tide goes out, the river goes down, and then yeah. And that's the other thing is that one of our fears is that Warm Springs or Grand Ronde or Cowlitz are going to host that tribal event, the journey. Almost everybody's going to be coming through Chinook country, so we're going to have to host them along the way, and we're close to the end, so it's going to be a lot of them. And our air territory is so big, they're going to be in there for 2 days, so we got to take care of them for 2 days. And we're not that wealthy, we probably get some fish and oysters and stuff like that, but we need to go out there and practice going upriver, so we know what we look like we know what we're doing. I've gone upriver. I was out here when the key was there. I paddled from Wintler Park with some of my buddies. They weren't Chinook people. They were just some of my buddies who wanted to get in a canoe. And we paddled down to the key. We sat there for a while. It was a sunny day, beautiful day. Talked to people. And then it came time to go back up. So we pushed off the dock and we started going back up. And I said, let's get over close to the restaurants. I go, put your paddles up. So we put our paddles up because I felt a breeze behind our head. And so we could use those paddles like sails, right? But that wouldn't do it all, right? So we're going by the restaurants, and I said, this is probably the first time these people seen Chinook canoe. And there was a tidal push coming in too, let alone one without anybody paddling. Because nobody was paddling, and we were doing about a mile an hour upriver, So yeah, it was good. So we know we can do it. It's all timing. Any other questions? Yes.
I'm as old as dirt, so I remember a lot of things from when I was a kid 70, 80 years ago. There used to be an annual powwow at Delta Park.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that Native peoples from the Grand Ronde, from Pendleton, from Warm Springs, I remember people from the Yakama Nation being there once. I'm wondering if at that time, back in the 1950s, if there was any activity from the Chinook people to be involved in those huge powwows, because sometimes there would be 2, 3,
Yeah, I
4
remember the powwows at Delta Park myself.
4,000 natives that were camped at Delta Park. You don't see that anymore, but
Yeah, well, we didn't powwow. We didn't potluck, because a lot of those people, you see that do powwow were marched into this area, to those reservations, and the other people, there was a relocation act where they decided they were going to either downsize on reservations or do away with some reservations, and so they just shipped people off to different cities, and Portland ended up being one of those cities. That's why you see all different types of Indians over in the Portland area, from different tribes that aren't even close to here. They just got shipped out, and they did that to other areas. But no, Chinook people, we had gatherings where we'd bring people in and do, our winter gatherings or first salmon ceremonies and stuff like that. We kind of liked our stuff. Those Salish people, they potlatched. Chinook people, we wanted to keep our stuff. We would trade a little bit. Yeah. But so when I got involved with the Indian Ed when Destiny was small, I had to learn about powwows. We just recently put on our Rising Generation powwow at Clark College last weekend, so it's still a little bit of a learning experience for me. But then again, I teach them about Chinook as well, so yeah. But yep, it's still going on. That powwow is still going on at over at Delta Park. Not as big as it used to be. Yeah, it used to be, everybody moved in and they camped there for a couple days, And I don't know if they're even allowed to camp there anymore, or if they want to camp there anymore. So, yeah. Any other questions? Well, we're still here. We're not going anywhere. Yes. Yeah. And like I said, we've always been here. We've always been treated as Indians. We just don't. We have all the problems that a reservation tribe would have. Suicide, drugs and so forth. But we don't have the help. And we could have prevented a lot of that. And our chairman, he lost a whole branch of his family through suicide, and no, it's sad. And the good, it wouldn't be that way if the government had honored that treaty, in good faith, and then still someone needs to step up to the plate. So, like I said, anytime you call, email, send a letter to any of the representatives or the senators, we were working with Camp Perez early on, and we gave her a clean bill. And basically, we gave her a bill that would recognize, correct our federal status. It didn't ask us to give up any more than we've already given up, and we didn't ask for any more than, we should have had. I think one reason is because we know that if we were going to fish or do some of these other things, that we're going to end up in court anyway, so why should we ask for it in the bill? Just give us our federal status and let us do the work, and so that's what we felt. So it should have been easy to bring it up just before she was campaigning for her second go-around. She came to us and she said, oh yeah, by the way, I tweaked your bill a little bit. You did what? She put in there that she wanted us to give up our fishing, aquaculture, and gathering rights to appease 5 crab fishermen, non-native fishermen. Yeah. She also put in there that in no way would this treaty acknowledge any of our treaty rights. Yeah. So I said, well, you're in luck. We're going to have our annual meeting in 2 weeks. We'll have them vote on it, and they voted 100% against any of that. So we said, and then we had to go public and just say, hey, we're cutting bait with her because she's not seeing it right.
Sam, we thank you very much. And before we end officially, we do have treats out in the North-X, and everybody can go out there and eat and talk to Sam individually. Could you explain, we have a donation basket. Could you explain about the Chinook language and what that money goes for?
Sure. Chinook, we spoke Chinook Wawa, and we spoke it with a lot of tribes, so that they were able to understand us. And today, we're trying to bring it back. Tony Johnson, our cultural chairman, he spent a lot of time down at Grand Ronde talking to their elders down there, and helped create the Chinook Wawa dictionary for them. And he also started an immersion program down there that is really running good. I think they're up. It used to be for kindergartners. Now I think it goes up to 3rd grade. But these kids go into there, and until noon, they speak nothing but Chinook Wawa. And in the afternoon, they can go ahead and speak English, Boston if they want. And they would police each other. Somebody might say, Yaka Bobby, Yaka Wawa, Boston. Bobby's talking Boston then, and he's supposed to be speaking Wawa, So, yeah. So, and then, it used to be that the elders were speaking it, like a code, and then the children wouldn't know, and but some of those elders have passed, Of course, Tony was luckily interviewed a lot of them to get that language down. And so then the kids started speaking, and then the parents started saying, oh, yeah, maybe we should start learning this too, because now they're all speaking code, So yeah, so there's a real thirst. So Lane Community College, teaches it as accredited class, and they also do, once they fill that up, then they go ahead and teach it. You can go in and take it non-credited. But sometimes it's hard for folks to, get the monies to be able to, pay that tuition to take it as accredited class. So we were trying, in fact, this year was really tough on them to try to do that. So I thought that this would be a really good chance for to raise funds to help keep that going, because if we don't get enough people in those credited classes, they'll drop it. you know, and, you know, then, you know, Chinook will probably, and, you know, I mean, Grand Ronde can teach it in their community. Us, we don't have a reservation, our people kind of scatter, so it's a little harder. We need places like Lane to be able to teach the class. So,
Okay, well, thank you very much. Give him applause.
Mossy. Mossy.
All right, we're welcome in the narthex to greet Sam back there. There's a donation basket right as you go out the door. And thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Hi, Mossy. Many thanks.